17 million Americans were watching when Denzel Washington looked JD Vance in the eye and did something no one expected. He didn't shout. He didn't walk out. He waited, just long enough for the Vice President to say the one sentence that would detonate everything. This wasn't a debate. It was an ambush broadcast live, and the moment Denzel stood up, the entire country knew something irreversible had begun. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. 17 million people were watching live when Denzel Washington unfolded a thick manila folder and set it gently on the polished table. The seal of the Urban Institute was stamped in blue across the top, a document too heavy with data to be dismissed with slogans. Cameras perched overhead like carrion birds waiting for the first misstep. The marble walls of the hearing room seemed to lean in closer, as if the building itself was holding its breath. He did not adjust the microphone. He did not clear his throat. He simply looked at the row of senators in front of him, then began to read in a voice so steady it felt like iron. "These cuts," he said, "will eliminate Medicaid coverage for more than 12 million low-income children." He paused and let the number hang there, 12 million. He repeated it, slower this time, as though repetition might make the statistic feel less obscene. "You will not see these children in spreadsheets," he continued. "You will see them in crowded emergency rooms, in funeral parlors, in classrooms where no one notices the cough that never goes away." Behind him, a congressional aide shifted uncomfortably. Another flipped through a binder, pretending to look for something important. Denzel did not look away. He held up a chart, red bars spiking across the page like alarms no one wanted to hear. "This is not about budgets," he said. "It is about who we choose to protect when the cameras turn off." His voice did not rise. He knew it did not need to. When he set the chart down, the air felt brittle, as if the room might crack under the weight of that calm indictment. A senator from Arkansas cleared his throat but did not speak. Someone else scribbled a note and underlined it twice. For a moment, it seemed possible the testimony might proceed with the gravity it deserved. Then JD Vance leaned forward. The Vice President's suit was charcoal, pressed to a perfection that made him look sculpted rather than alive. He adjusted his microphone with 2 fingers, not looking up from the prepared remarks in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was dry as paper. "Mr. Washington," he began, "Medicaid is economic heroin." The words landed like a backhand across the face of the chamber. A ripple moved through the rows of aides and advisors, an audible inhalation that no one tried to disguise. But Vance was not finished. He turned a page in his folder, the motion deliberate, almost bored. "You and your Hollywood donors," he continued, "push dependency because you've never seen real work. You have no idea what it costs to build a life without someone else's charity." He lifted his gaze just long enough to deliver the final line, each word pronounced with surgical precision. "And you don't get to lecture those of us who climbed out of poverty without Hollywood handouts." Silence expanded to fill every inch of the chamber. No one moved. No one spoke. A camera panned across the dais, capturing the expression on each senator's face as they struggled to decide whether to look away or watch. One aide touched a finger to her earpiece, murmured something too soft to hear. Another picked up a phone, thumb already moving across the screen, sending the clip into the bloodstream of the internet before the echo of Vance's sentence had faded. A young congressman in the back shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the table in front of him as if trying not to be seen. No one laughed. No one applauded. The condemnation was too naked, too practiced, too cold to pretend it had been spontaneous. Denzel did not flinch. He did not look down. The only movement was the tightening of the tendons in his jaw, a flicker of something ancient and exhausted that passed behind his eyes. He folded his hands over the report again, thumb tapping once against the cardboard edge as if reminding himself not to respond. In that moment, the imbalance was complete. Vance had not merely rejected a policy argument. He had tried to make a man smaller. He had taken a lifetime of service, a record of philanthropy and discipline and credibility, and stripped it of meaning with a single smirk and a line rehearsed behind closed doors. The silence held, not because no one knew what to say, but because everyone knew precisely what had been done. and no one was certain what would happen now that the country had seen it too. Within minutes of the hearing, the clip had detonated across every feed, every channel, every phone screen that still had battery left. It began as a single video, a shaky stream from the back of the chamber where someone had dared to hold their phone aloft. The audio was grainy, but the words were unmistakable. Medicaid is economic heroin. You and your Hollywood donors push dependency because you've never seen real work. In less than an hour, it was clipped, captioned, and spliced next to another recording from 2016. A Fox News segment no one had bothered to delete. JD Vance in a navy suit, smiling thinly as he leaned into the host's microphone. Back then, he had said it like a punchline. Medicaid, he told the camera, is just the needle. The real addiction is the belief that government will fix everything. Someone stitched the two clips together, the old smirk and the new one. The same phrase, delivered 8 years apart with the same precision. When it hit Twitter, it spread like a virus with no cure. Comment threads split into warring factions within minutes. One side called it the final proof that the vice president was nothing more than a polished opportunist, a man who weaponized contempt for applause. They called it cruelty in a suit, arrogance wrapped in a flag pin. The other side called it courage. Finally, they wrote, someone telling the truth about welfare dependency. Comment after comment praised Vance for saying what others were too afraid to admit. News networks scrambled to keep up. CNN ran the footage on a split screen with statistics on child poverty. Fox News framed it as a necessary reality check. MSNBC cut to a panel of strategists who all spoke at once, their voices rising over each other until no words were distinguishable at all. In living rooms and break rooms, people watched the same 30 seconds looped again and again. The repetition became its own kind of violence, a reminder that it was not a slip, not a flubbed phrase, but something that had been simmering behind that practiced smile for years. Denzel Washington did not release a statement that afternoon. He did not call a press conference or record a video. Instead, he arrived quietly at the steps of the Capitol, the same folder tucked under his arm. Reporters were already waiting, microphones extended like weapons, lenses trained on the first hint of emotion. He stopped at the bottom step, letting the questions swirl around him like smoke. A woman from the Washington Post asked whether he planned to sue. A man from CBS demanded to know if he regretted testifying at all. Another voice, brittle and urgent, called out above the rest. "Do you regret it?" The reporter repeated. "Do you regret coming here today?" Denzel lifted his gaze slowly, not to the cameras, but to the line of young aides standing behind the barricade. They looked back at him with expressions he recognized too well. Part hope, part fatigue, part dread. He swallowed once before speaking. "This isn't about my feelings," he said, each syllable measured, deliberate. "It's about their future." He didn't elaborate. He didn't correct the headlines already blooming across the internet. He didn't tell them how many nights he had sat with families who relied on Medicaid to keep their children breathing. He didn't tell them about the funeral he had attended 6 months earlier for a boy whose inhaler had been rationed to make the prescription last longer. He didn't mention that the folder he carried was filled not just with statistics, but with names. Real names? He only let the sentence hang in the damp spring air. "This isn't about my feelings, it's about their future." Then he turned away, climbing the steps without looking back. The cameras tracked him, but they could not capture what had shifted. They could not measure the quiet that followed him into the building, the way even the Capitol Police stood a little straighter as he passed. By evening, the debate had fractured into 100 arguments. Political consultants called it a distraction. Economists called it inevitable. Commentators called it a clash of philosophies. But anyone who watched the unedited video knew it was none of those things. It was a deliberate diminishment. A performance calibrated to reduce a man to an anecdote, a cautionary tale about what happens when you bring empathy to a knife fight. The algorithms rewarded the conflict. Headlines grew sharper, chyrons scrolled faster. Medicaid is economic heroin. The phrase became a hashtag, then a chant, then a litmus test for which side you were on. And somewhere in that roar, the truth throbbed like an exposed nerve. A truth that no amount of spin could bury, that a line had been crossed, and the country had seen it happen in real time. At 9:02 a.m. On a gray Thursday morning, a clerk at the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., accepted a binder that would ignite something larger than any press conference ever could. The cover was thick red cardstock, unadorned except for a single title embossed in gold, Washington v. Vance. Below it in smaller print was the number no one could ignore, $100 million. Inside the binder lay 300 pages of evidence, exhibits, and sworn statements. The first section contained the same Urban Institute report Denzel had held up in the hearing room, each chart flagged in bright yellow. 12 million children projected to lose care if the proposed cuts passed unchallenged. Names of counties and school districts where the cuts would hit the hardest. It was methodical, unflinching, the kind of data that did not care whose ideology it offended. But it was the second section that made the clerk pause and look up, as if needing to confirm she was reading it correctly. Tucked between exhibits was an email chain dated 6 days before the hearing. The subject line was as blunt as a hammer: highlight the hypocrisy, provoke the collapse. The sender was a senior advisor in the Vice President's communications team. The body of the email was even colder. If he takes the bait, the story shifts from policy to personality. It always works. By mid-morning, copies of the filing had leaked to the press. CNN broke the story first, flashing a headline across the bottom of the screen in urgent red. Denzel Washington sues Vice President for defamation and malice. Reporters scrambled to confirm the authenticity of the documents, but it was too late to slow the avalanche. Within the hour, a spokesperson for JD Vance stepped in front of a line of microphones, reading from a prepared statement with the brisk detachment of someone who had practiced it in a mirror. "This is nothing more than a publicity stunt," she announced. "A policy debate taken wildly out of context. The Vice President will not be intimidated by theatrics." The cameras clicked in unison as she folded the paper and stepped back. No questions, no elaboration, just a line drawn in the sand as though dismissing the lawsuit would be enough to erase it. But outside that press room, the country was already dividing into camps. Fox News cut to a legal panel within minutes, anchors frowning into the camera while captions scrolled beneath them. "Washington's fragile ego," one commentator sneered, "has finally met the reality of hard policy." Another called the lawsuit a dangerous precedent. If every political disagreement ends in court, he warned, no one will ever speak the truth again. On MSNBC, the mood was different. One analyst read aloud the email subject line, then looked directly into the camera. "This isn't about truth," she said, her voice low. "This is about using power to humiliate a witness for daring to speak in defense of the vulnerable." In a segment that went viral before the hour ended, a civil rights historian laid out the stakes with unvarnished clarity. "When you design a moment to break someone publicly," she said, "and you do it under color of official power, you are not debating policy. You are manufacturing disgrace, and you are counting on the country to look away, but no one was looking away now." Reporters began to stake out the courthouse steps, hoping for a statement. They did not get one. Denzel had not scheduled any appearances. He had not called any networks. Inside his office, he sat at a narrow conference table with his legal team, reviewing line by line the motion they were about to file alongside the complaint. It was not a gesture. It was a demand for accountability that no televised debate could blunt. The motion asserted that Vance's words were not protected speech, but targeted defamation delivered with clear intent to harm both personally and professionally. The language was precise, almost clinical, the kind of clarity that made excuses impossible. Outside, the temperature dropped as clouds thickened over the city. Still, journalists did not leave. They refreshed their feeds. They called their editors. They practiced the phrases they would soon record for the evening broadcasts. By late afternoon, newspapers were already running side-by-side headlines. CNN called it the legal ignition point. Fox News called it theatrics in a suit. The contrast was not subtle, and it was not accidental. A poll released by a major network showed that public opinion had split almost evenly. 46% believed the vice president had gone too far. 42% said he was simply telling uncomfortable truths. 12% admitted they had not watched the hearing at all, but they recognized the phrase Medicaid is economic heroin. The repetition had achieved what no strategy memo could fully control. The phrase had become a symbol, but what it symbolized was now contested territory. In the last hour before dusk, a reporter finally caught sight of Denzel leaving the side entrance of his office building, the red folder clutched under his arm. She called out his name, her voice echoing across the pavement. He did not break stride. He did not turn his head. But as he passed the line of cameras, he glanced up just long enough to meet the lens straight on. It was not defiance. It was something older and quieter. A stillness that was no longer just a choice, but proof. Proof that he had not been baited into fury. Proof that this was never about ego. He kept walking as flashbulbs cracked through the cold evening air. And in living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their screens, feeling the shape of something they could not yet name, but already knew would not fade easily. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the doors to courtroom 4B swung open, and the audience filed in under the gaze of marshals who looked as though they had been instructed not merely to maintain order, but to bear witness. Every seat was filled before the bailiff had finished calling the case. A low murmuring drifted through the rows as people adjusted their coats and silenced their phones. The small, nervous movements of a crowd that already suspected it was about to see something historic. Denzel Washington entered without escort, carrying the same red folder that had become the quiet emblem of this fight. He did not pause for photographs. He did not acknowledge the journalists perched in the press box with their laptops open like traps. He walked to the plaintiff's table, placed the folder in front of him, and sat with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew he had nothing left to prove. Across the aisle, JD Vance sat flanked by two attorneys in dark suits. He was not smirking this morning. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a vein in his neck stood out like a wire. His hands were folded on the table, but every few seconds one finger twitched, tapping a silent rhythm against the polished wood. The judge entered, a tall man in his 60s with the measured bearing of someone who had long ago learned that authority was not something you declared, but something you carried. When he looked over the docket, the rustling in the gallery stopped as if someone had pressed mute on the entire room. This case, he began, is not about whether public officials are entitled to debate policy. It is about whether that debate becomes a personal campaign of defamation intended to damage not only reputation but dignity. He set the docket aside and met the eyes of each counsel in turn. We will proceed with clarity and without theatrics. The first hour was occupied by procedural motions. Vance's attorneys argued that the entire complaint was a political stunt, that the words in question were protected under the principles of vigorous debate. Denzel's lead counsel countered that what the vice president had done was not debate, but orchestration, an attempt to collapse a witness under the weight of public scorn. When the judge finally ruled that the recordings submitted by the plaintiff were admissible, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A technician rolled a small console to the front, cables trailing behind like veins, and connected it to the speaker system. The screen at the side of the room remained dark, but the small green light on the audio panel glowed steadily. Denzel sat motionless, his hands resting lightly on the folder. He did not look at Vance. He did not look at the screen. He stared straight ahead as though the moment approaching was not something he needed to watch to believe. The technician adjusted the volume and looked at the judge for confirmation. At a nod, he pressed play. A hiss of ambient static filled the speakers, followed by the low scrape of a chair and a voice that was unmistakable even when flattened by recording equipment. "Push him until he breaks." The words were delivered in a tone so casual it made the gallery collectively draw breath. That's how you bury a moral witness. The second sentence landed heavier than the first, a deliberate stripping away of any illusion that the cruelty had been spontaneous. Then came the line that seemed to pull the oxygen from every corner of the chamber. "Then we'll call him unstable on every network." The silence afterward was complete, a stillness so total that for a moment no one moved, as though movement might somehow lessen the weight of what they had just heard. At the defense table, one of Vance's attorneys shifted forward, his hand already lifting. His voice was sharp, too loud in the hush. Objection irrelevant and prejudicial. The judge turned his head slowly, the kind of deliberate gesture that carried more condemnation than any raised voice. "Overruled," he said. "The objection is noted and denied." The lawyer's mouth tightened, but he did not speak again. In the front row, a woman covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes glistening. A man beside her scribbled something on a legal pad, but did not seem to notice he had snapped the pencil in half. The court reporter's fingers hovered just above the keys, as if she too needed a second to absorb the clarity of what had been revealed. Vance did not look at anyone. His gaze was locked on a point in the center of the table, the muscles along his jaw working with each measured breath. For the first time since the hearing, he looked less like a man performing control, and more like one bracing for a reckoning he could not charm away. The judge leaned back in his chair. He did not speak right away, and that pause became its own kind of verdict. A verdict that did not need a gavel to be understood. Denzel's counsel stood, voice steady. "Your Honor, we submit that this recording demonstrates not just an intention to discredit, but a strategy to provoke personal collapse, executed under the authority of public office." He turned slightly, gesturing to the table where Denzel sat unmoving. The plaintiff did not respond in kind, did not lift his eyes or nod in agreement. His stillness was the point. It was the refusal to meet premeditated hostility with spectacle. The judge inclined his head just once. The record will reflect the submission. In the gallery, the hush held like a held breath, a collective understanding that this was not merely evidence. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, a view into how easily institutional power could be sharpened into a weapon. The technician removed the recording device with the same care as if he were disarming something explosive. And perhaps he was. The evidence had been presented, the room had heard it. The country soon enough would hear it too. As the equipment was wheeled away, Denzel finally exhaled, the only movement he allowed himself. A slow breath that did not carry relief but something closer to acknowledgement. He did not look at JD Vance. He did not need to. The truth was no longer something to be debated. It was something that had spoken for itself. And in that fragile silence, every person watching understood they had just witnessed the unmasking of intent, the moment when pretense gave way to proof. The courtroom had not regained its rhythm after the recording. Even the sound of paper being shifted on the tables seemed too loud, too sharp against the weight of what had been played. The judge gave a single nod to the plaintiff's counsel, granting permission to proceed with cross-examination. Denzel's lead attorney stepped forward, carrying nothing but a single sheet of paper folded once. He did not clear his throat. He did not look at the cameras clustered along the far wall. His voice, when it came, was so quiet the microphones had to catch it like a confession. "Mr. Vice President," he began, "did you ever refer to Medicaid as economic heroin outside of public statements?" Vance did not look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the polished wood of the witness stand. For a moment he did not answer. The silence stretched out until it became a question in itself, the kind that demanded its own response. "I don't recall," he said finally. His voice was thin, almost clinical. The lawyer did not move. He did not look away. He let the sentence hang in the air, letting it absorb into every person listening. In the second row, a woman closed her eyes. Someone near the aisle adjusted their tie with a hand that trembled just enough to be visible. The attorney's gaze dropped to the paper in his hand, as though he were reading a line he already knew by heart. He lifted it again, his tone unchanged. "Did you ever refer to people like Mr. Washington as professional victims in any internal communication?" This time, Vance's mouth tightened before he spoke. His fingers tapped once-twice against the edge of the table. The sound was soft but carried in the hush, a brittle percussion that betrayed more than any words could. Again, he said, "I don't recall." No one in the gallery moved. No one shifted. It was the kind of stillness that felt too deliberate to be an accident, as though the entire room was waiting for something it could not quite name. The judge watched without interruption. His expression gave nothing away. From the plaintiff's table, Denzel's breathing remained steady. His eyes stayed locked forward, never once turning to look at the man whose voice had filled the speakers an hour earlier. But something in the set of his shoulders changed, a tension rising through his spine like a current preparing to discharge. He did not wait for his counsel to prompt him. He did not wait for permission. He stood smooth and unhurried as though the movement had been inevitable all along. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You didn't forget," he said, each word so quiet it forced the room to lean closer. "You repeated it." Vance's eyes lifted then, not in defiance but in reflex, as though the pull of those words was stronger than the instinct to look away. Denzel's hands rested lightly on the back of his chair. He did not point. He did not gesture. He only looked at the man across from him and continued, his voice iron wrapped in velvet. "Because to you, policy isn't about people. It's about leverage." No reaction followed, no instant rebuttal. The sentence landed in the hollow space between them, the kind of sentence that did not require elaboration because it had already said everything. A reporter scribbled a note and then stopped halfway through the line, as if realizing the futility of trying to capture it in print. An aide in the back pressed her lips together, eyes darting to the floor. Vance's jaw flexed once, a muscle along his temple pulsing, but he did not respond. His fingers returned to tapping the wood, a quiet staccato that sounded almost like retreat. The judge cleared his throat, a single sound that broke the trance but did not erase it. "Mr. Washington, please return to your seat," he said gently. Denzel did not look at the judge. He did not look at the gallery. He lowered himself back into the chair without haste, as though the air itself had become heavier. The silence that followed was not empty. It was saturated with the unspoken knowledge that something final had been laid bare, not a policy dispute, not a clash of ideologies, but the raw anatomy of contempt, dissected in real time under oath. In the rows behind the press table, no one dared to fill the space with commentary. For the first time all morning, even the court stenographer hesitated before resuming her steady rhythm. Denzel folded his hands together and rested them on the table. He did not look at Vance again. He did not need to. The room had heard what it came to hear. The country, when the footage aired, would hear it too. And nothing in the vice president's practiced composure could disguise the truth that had just been spoken into the record, beyond spin, beyond denial, beyond the reach of any carefully rehearsed line. The courtroom doors remained closed for 4 hours while the jury deliberated. Each minute passed like an hour, the quiet so absolute that even the reporters began to whisper in voices frayed by the weight of waiting. No one left their seats. No one dared to speculate aloud. They all knew that whatever happened next would not only decide a case, but define a threshold the country had been circling for years. Denzel sat as he had since the beginning, hands folded over the red folder that had never left his side. He did not shift in his chair or look at the clock mounted high on the back wall. It was as though he had already made peace with whatever verdict would come. JD Vance's lawyers sat in tense formation, their heads bowed over notes they no longer pretended to read. The vice president himself had stopped tapping the table. Now he simply stared at the wood grain with an expression emptied of all calculation, his shoulders sloping lower with each passing hour. When the door finally opened, every head turned in the same instant. The jury filed back into the box one by one, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on some point only they could see. The forewoman, a middle-aged nurse with lines of quiet fatigue etched around her mouth, held a single envelope between her hands. The judge did not speak immediately. He watched them all take their places, waited for the last juror to settle, then inclined his head with the gravity of a man about to translate something irreversible into words. "Madam Forewoman, have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Please hand it to the clerk." The nurse walked forward, each step measured as though she feared the envelope might ignite if she moved too quickly. She passed it to the clerk without looking at either party, then returned to her seat and folded her hands in her lap. The judge opened the envelope slowly, reading the verdict to himself first. For a moment, the entire room seemed to tighten around the quiet. Then he lifted his gaze and began to read aloud. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Washington." A single gasp broke from somewhere in the back row, the sound of a person trying and failing to swallow relief. The judge did not pause. "We further find that the defendant, Vice President JD Vance, engaged in intentional defamation with actual malice and in abuse of official power to humiliate and discredit the plaintiff publicly." A reporter exhaled a ragged whisper. Jesus Christ. Vance closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he did not look up. His hands slid from the tabletop to his lap, palms turned toward the floor as though to steady himself against the judgment he could no longer outrun. The judge continued, "We award damages in the amount of $100 million. The words hung in the air like a bell that would not stop ringing. A woman in the gallery pressed both hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking in silent sobs. Another man closed his eyes and bowed his head. JD Vance did not lift his gaze. He did not flinch, but his posture slumped, the last reserves of performance draining out of him all at once. He looked in that moment not like a vice president or a strategist, but like a man who had finally glimpsed the cost of everything he had chosen to do. The judge set the papers aside, his expression unchanged. "This court is adjourned." The gavel struck the block with a single, resonant report. In the sudden commotion that followed, reporters gathering their equipment, attorneys exchanging hushed instructions, Denzel remained seated. His breathing was steady, his face composed, but something in the set of his shoulders softened, as if a weight he had carried alone had finally been lifted by other hands. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that pause the chaos receded. The cameras, the headlines, the hundreds of voices climbing over each other to claim the narrative, none of it mattered. When he opened them again, he did not look to the press. He did not search the room for approval. He simply drew in a breath and spoke words no microphone needed to amplify. "This is for my mother." No flourish, no explanation, just a sentence that landed with the quiet gravity of something truer than any verdict could ever be. And for a moment longer, the room held its breath with him, as though everyone present understood that the real judgment had never belonged to the court at all. The next morning, the courthouse steps were already crowded before dawn. Reporters jostled for position, cords tangled around their ankles, microphones balanced on shoulders slick with dew. No one knew exactly what Denzel Washington planned to say. They only knew it would not be small. He appeared just after 7, alone except for the thin folder he held against his chest. The sun was climbing over the marble columns, casting long stripes of light across the plaza. For a moment, as he stepped up to the podium, it looked as though the shadows were parting to clear the way. He did not smile. He did not adjust the microphones or wait for the crowd to quiet. His voice was as steady as it had been in the courtroom, a calm that made every other sound recede. "Yesterday was not about winning a lawsuit," he began. "It was about telling the truth when the truth became inconvenient to power." He paused, scanning the faces lifted toward him. Some were familiar. Journalists who had followed every hearing, activists who had sat through long nights of testimony. Others were strangers who had arrived without credentials, drawn by something they could not name but recognized all the same. "I have heard people call this moment a victory," he continued, "but I don't see it that way, because a victory suggests that the work is over and nothing could be further from the truth." He lifted the folder then, its corners worn from weeks of being carried place to place, and set it gently on the podium. "This," he said, "is the founding document for a new fund." A ripple of movement traveled through the press line as cameras tilted forward. "It's called power without permission." He let the name settle. He did not rush to explain it. "It will train and support voices too often silenced in the name of decorum," he said. "Voices that have been told to wait their turn, to tone down their anger, to disguise their urgency so that no one feels uncomfortable." Somewhere behind the barricade, a young woman pressed her hand to her mouth. A college organizer from Detroit, her sign propped against her leg, its letters smudged from the morning's damp. She turned to the man beside her and whispered so softly the words almost dissolved in the air. "He just changed everything." Denzel looked out at the crowd, his gaze moving across the lenses and note cards, the hopeful and the hardened. "I'm not interested in respectability politics," he said. "I'm not interested in waiting for permission from the people who benefit most from delay." The words were quiet, but they struck like a hammer on stone. "I'm done asking for space in rooms I've already earned." A hush settled over the plaza, different from the hush of the courtroom. This was not the silence of judgment. It was the stillness that comes when a truth finds its target and takes root. Reporters did not shout questions. For a moment, no one moved to break the gravity of what had been declared. Denzel closed the folder, but he did not lower his hand. "If you are watching this," he said, "and you have ever been told that your story was too disruptive or your outrage too impolite, know this. You are not the problem. You are the proof that this system needs to change." He stepped back from the microphones then, as if to signal that he was finished. But before he turned away, he looked up into the rising light, his expression neither triumphant nor relieved. Just clear, and in living rooms and break rooms across the country, thousands of people reached for their phones. They signed pledges and posted messages, and shared the recording of his words with captions that said simply, "This is the moment." When he finally walked back inside, he did not look back to see the cameras still trained on the empty podium. He knew already that the story was no longer his alone. It was an inheritance passed to anyone willing to claim it. An inheritance that would not wait quietly in the shadows any longer.